See. Hello, everyone, and it's great to see everybody again. Last year, when I was a keynote speaker here last year, and I told a little bit of a story about my life story and how the themes of last year, which were dream, change, and inspire, how my story kind of matched with that. And so many people came up afterwards and said, well, what's the next chapter? What's the next chapter? And it's amazing how the next chapter matches so much with what we have this year, which is this transition from dream, change, and inspire to where we are now, imagine, innovate, and inflect. So I'm going to step back here and just to give a recap for those who were not here last year about the dream, change, and inspire. When I was 14 years old, I was inspired by a speaker to write a list of life goals. He said, what would you do with your life if you were 100% guaranteed to succeed? Now think about that for yourself. What would you do with your life if you knew you were going to succeed? So, I don't know, I was 14 and it was an Olympic year, so I wrote down I wanted to be an Olympic athlete. Now I was a JV junior varsity swimmer and track athlete. So that would be really crazy to be able to say that I could do that. But I wrote it anyway. And of course, what do Olympic athletes do? They become TV commentators. So I wrote that down too. And I said, I want to be a pilot. Now, there were no female airline pilots, and I wasn't thinking of being an airline pilot at the time. I just wanted to fly small airplanes because I drove by the little airport where we lived all the time, and I just thought that was magic, that airplanes could fly. Well, over the course of the time, I went to Stanford as an undergrad, and I entered an essay contest to be an Olympic torchbearer in Lake Placid. Once I was there, I saw the sport of luge, and very quickly it became a concept. Oh my goodness, I wrote this list 8 years before to be an Olympic athlete. So I actually did it, applied for the program and was accepted, and spent the next 12 years of my life competing in the Olympic sports. I competed in 3 Olympics. And as I was wrapping up my athletic career, I was asked by KGO TV here in San Francisco if I could do some evening news. Went back to my list. Lo and behold, at that point now, it was 15 years prior, and sure enough, so I worked here in San Francisco in the evening news. Now, while I was at the evening news, I walked into the weather station at the TV station. So those of you you see the weatherman, he gets up there and he talks about all that stuff. Well, weathermen tend to often be pilots because weather and pilots obviously go hand in hand. And I started looking at the weather charts, and he said, "Are you interested in this?" I said, "Yeah, someday I want to be a pilot." And I never forget his response. He said, "Why don't you just go to the airport and try it out? Take 3 lessons. Take 3 lessons." As I didn't know anything about flying. So I went down to the Palo Alto airport. I was 28 years old. Walked in. I knew airplanes had wings. That's about it. Started learning to fly, and I became so passionate about aviation over the course of the next 2 years, spent more and more time flying and then teaching flying, and then ultimately became a pilot at United Airlines. So this is where the next step happens, right? So yes, I checked off those boxes, became a pilot, worked in television, a 3-time Olympian. I get back to that word inspire. So what happens next? As a pilot, I became a pilot at JetBlue. And then over the course of time, while I'm a pilot, and JetBlue is kind of known for being innovative, spent about 13 years, and JetBlue said to me, what is it in Silicon Valley that is so special? Is there something that we can bring to that the Valley can bring to JetBlue? Can you see what entrepreneurs are out there? So when I think about inspiration, what is the next chapter for somebody who has been successful? The next chapter is to inspire others. And so this is where we launched JetBlue Technology Ventures. This is actually a picture from the cockpit of an Embraer 190. It's a 100-seat aircraft. It is the aircraft I fly. I took this picture. It is the 30,000-foot view. It is actually at 31,000 feet for those of you who can actually see the augmented reality, if you will. At 31,000 feet, and we're climbing, I'm headed west. The view at JetBlue Technology Ventures is to look beyond the horizon, to see what else is out there. How might travel change? If you could think back in terms of the automobile, what are some things that are changing so much? I know there's an autonomous vehicle track. We can talk about electric and how that's changing. How might that type of technology impact aviation? And who is going to look into it? And so this is where JetBlue Technology Ventures plays, is thinking, what is the future 50 years from now, 20 years from now? How will you get from where you are now to where you want to be? For those of you who are from here in the Bay Area, you may be in the autonomous vehicles, it may be the vertical takeoff and landing helicopters. For those of you traveling down to LA, do you think you'll still drive on the 101 to drive up to San Francisco, to go through security, to get on an airplane, to sit in air traffic control delays, to wait till you get to go down to LA, then wait for your car to get to your destination? That entire journey may be taking 5 hours. Our vision is to empower entrepreneurs to help us change transportation. And that's where I think of where today's conference, why it makes such a difference. We've imagined that transportation will be different. We're partnering on the innovation out here to see what it might be and how might it inflect and change our business. This is what corporate venture does, is it thinks about how can we disrupt ourselves from the outside in. And so through JetBlue Technology Ventures, what we've done is we saw 906 entrepreneurs last year. We invested in 7. And I'm very excited to share with you and to introduce Ashish Kumar. Today is the first, we've just invested in this startup along with Boeing. Today is the very first time where he's publicly speaking out to an audience about the Stealth company. We announced it 2 weeks ago, about the future of transportation. How might aviation change? I will tell you, it's not going to be what you think it is. So please, I'd like to introduce Ashish Kumar, who started his career at the ITT in Delhi. He's a graduate, got his bachelor's in mechanical engineering, then came over here to the US, got a master's and a PhD in mechanical and aerospace engineering, did a tour through Dell, Microsoft, Google, McKinsey, and another entrepreneur came to him with this idea a few years ago. We believe that this is how you will be traveling from the Bay Area to LA, or from New York to Florida, or perhaps to the various cities within India in a few years from now. Please welcome Ashish Kumar. And I will say we are both going to be here after, we'll have a few minutes for questions when we finish. And then when we finish after the 30 minutes are up, we'll stay here during lunch to answer questions as well.
Thank you, Bonnie. I think there's been a lot of tracks around venture capital and entrepreneurship, but our journey is, a journey of a heavy-duty hardware startup. In general, is on the fringes of the mainstream, and some folks have termed it the valley of death. That clean tech hardware or a scale hardware entrepreneur has to go through, which separates exciting concepts from commercialization. And we ran into Bonnie and her team at JetBlue Technology Ventures roughly last July, when we were making our way through our valley of death with varied levels of interest from a collection of corporates and from some VCs, but generally folks hesitating to take the next step. And it was when Bonnie and her team engaged, it was just an immediate market change. So if you talk about inspiration and speed and drive, it's really changed our journey. So thanks, Bonnie. So we, together with our partners at JetBlue Technology Ventures and Boeing Horizon X, we are working to bring affordable high-speed travel to every community. Our goal is to establish aviation as the leading mode of fast regional transit and as a capital-light alternative to highways and high-speed rail. Over the past 70 years, the jet engine has revolutionized the way we travel and connected the Earth like never in its past. The air miles we travel have doubled every 15 years and have gone from 1 trillion a year in 1980 and on track to 13 trillion by 2030. And driving this growth has been very deep scale down of the costs of flying, and that's dropped by half over the past 30 years. But the success of the jet engine has come with a severe price over regional distances. This has driven a 70-year shift of the airlines to large aircraft, and that has had a dramatic impact on the regional fleets. In 1980, the US was served by 300 regional carriers flying on average a 20-seat aircraft that you see over there. By 2010, the seat count had tripled to 60 seats. More recently, carriers are standardizing to 80 seats, and many predict that the growth is going to continue. While this scale down has been critical to drive down the costs of aviation, it has also meant that destinations served have reduced to a very small number of high-volume hubs. So much so that just 1% of the airports in the US today carry 96% of our air traffic. And where has that brought us? Many of you traveled by air to come here. Think back to your trip and how you spend your time along the journey. If you traveled commercial air from under 1,000 miles away, chances are you spend over 70% of your time on the ground, driving to a hub, transiting a hub, sitting on the tarmac, waiting or taxiing. We call this flying, but less than 30% of these trips is actually in flight. And as a result, we drive long distances an awful lot. For sub-1,000-mile trips in the US, just 4% of those are on air today. And that fraction is declining as aircraft sizes increase and carriers continue to consolidate. And this dynamic has given rise to what we believe is the largest challenge in transportation today, a regional transport gap, where we have thousands of communities with poor or no access to high-speed transport, distant hubs, infrequent departures, few destinations, high fares. And where you do have good access, door-to-door times haven't improved in decades. And alternatives that exist, like high-speed rail, are limited by their economics to just a few high-density corridors. And this is where we step in at Zunam. We are building 10 to 50-seat hybrid to electric aircraft that are intended to take on this challenge. From 700 miles in the early 2020s to 1,000 miles by over 1,000 miles by 2030, these aircraft are tailored for high-frequency services to thousands of secondary airports. These bring together quiet, green propulsion for all our access to close-in airports to communities, with cabins designed for fast walk-on, walk-off transit, no baggage belts, much less TSA, as close as we can move this to boarding a bus or a train. And these aircraft are designed to operate in an air system that will look very different, the regional air system that will look very different from the hub and spoke model of today, which merely reflects the scale economics of the jet engine. The unique economics of the hybrids that is much less scale dependent will give rise to an air system in its own shape that will be much more distributed, with aircrafts of a wide variety of sizes serving large numbers of communities. And how do we get there? Well, our aircraft are powered by range-optimized series hybrid powertrain that are powered by modular batteries in the wing and range extenders in the rear fuselage to give you a sense of scale, our 10-seat aircraft will have batteries on board that land somewhere between electric sedan and an electric bus. And the aircraft are future-proof, so an operator, each time they bring it in for an upgrade on batteries, they'll see performance improvements. And by the 2030s, many of them will be in a position to unhook from the range extender and go all electric. All thrust is generated by the quiet electric propulsors, and these are very much like the bypass fans you see at the front of a jet engine. But unlike the jets, our fans are powered by lightweight electric drives and have a variable pitch that are optimized to regional trips. And these give you very fine thrust control, reverse thrust, and regenerative braking. The impact of these on regional transport is going to be stunning. You will get to places 2 to 4 times faster than you do today and at lower fare. You'll have frequent flights to thousands of communities across the US and many more around the globe. From, as Bonnie mentioned, from the Valley to LA, you're talking 2.5 hours door to door versus 5 hours today, and roughly $170 round trip. The impact on less busy routes like Salt Lake City, Redding, Santa Barbara, San Diego would be even greater. You could even head off for a day of skiing in Tahoe with an hour-and-a-half door-to-slope transit time at $100 round trip. And all this comes with a transition to zero emissions by the 2030s. And given short haul generates 40% of all aviation emissions, this dramatic improvement in mobility comes with this huge gift to the Earth and to our future generations. Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to do some questions. So to answer all those folks who asked me last year, what is your next chapter? I hope this gives a good illustration. I believe that successful leaders, their next chapter in life is to inspire others. And what better way to do it is through inspiring entrepreneurs. And if you can imagine, go back, gosh, it would have been 12 years ago or so, at the initial launch as the idea was coming out of Tesla. And if you had been at that very first talk, where it is now, I hope in 10 to 12 years or by the year 2030, when you're stepping on one of the Sunam aircraft, you will remember today and you will remember Ashish. So with that, we're open to questions either on the venture capital side. I'm giving an illustration of what one of the investments we have, or on electric hybrid propulsion, for those who have questions. Yes, I think there's a mic that's coming around here too. Oh, there's someone right there, yes.
I have a question. Business-wise, this seems to be a pretty capital-intensive. Was curious how much capital you have raised, and also what's the business model that you're working on?
Unfortunately, aviation creates a perception of capital intensity, but that actually varies. There are data sets that will relate the program costs of aircraft to the speed and size. Right, and then if you scale it down, you actually come to levels, that for this class of aircraft is not that dissimilar from what you'd have to raise for a software startup over a 10-year period, and the revenue profile. But it's different. It's different from a VC standpoint because of the regulatory cycle, and you don't actually see revenues perhaps till 6 years in, and you do get customer commits at the 3-year time frame. So I think it's a very unfamiliar return cycle in the VC space, and there is unfortunately a perception that's driven by the commercial aircraft business today, which is large airliners, which actually are completely different levels of capital intensity. We are not disclosing how much we raised. I think we expect to be raising our next round in the next year or two, and the amount across Boeing and JetBlue to allow us to scale very aggressively towards an early 2020s aircraft, ready 5 to 6 years from now to market.
So I'll answer that too a little bit. This is an example, a classic example, where the difference between corporate venture capital and regular venture capital, obviously as regular VCs, you need to have your return and your exit in that seven-year-ish time frame. On the corporate venture, so if you are an entrepreneur and you're looking for perhaps some strategic value or a little bit less on the time pressure, that's where corporate venture comes in. So Ashish came, so JetBlue Technology Ventures and Boeing are not looking for an immediate return. I mean, the aircraft build cycles are so long anyway. But the reality is, so for us, we can come in very, very early, help him scale to the point where he can begin taking orders of aircraft, because airlines start ordering aircraft 7 to 10 years in advance. So we're funding him in that early cycle, which gets him to an order book of airlines, and at that point, additional venture capital comes in. So it's just being creative about the process.
Great idea. I think it's tremendous potential.
Thanks.
But how do you deal with the ground logistics and capacity issues? I mean, just about any airline of any size, even private jets and all that, have issues of landing, airports and all of that. So how do you, I mean, you can have the greatest plane, carbon emissions and all that, you check all the boxes. Where are you going to land all these things?
Let me start on this first, because this is part of our thesis. Every investor has to have a thesis, and we have 5 areas that we focus on with customer-centric and maintenance and such. We have this thesis around regional transportation. We believe that airlines, as they exist today, will exist for 50 years beyond. So the JetBlues and Uniteds and Air Indias and whatever will be around, but it'll be for long haul. Short haul is where we believe there's the disruption because of this. The reality is that although you say the corporate jets and all of that, that there's all this congestion, that's if you go into the major airports. There is absolutely no congestion when you go to airports like a San Carlos or some of the smaller airports. And in the US, there are commercially viable airports, 5,000 of them. There's actually 13,000 airports total, but these small airports. And so we look at both the unlocking the value of all those corporate jets that are out there. That is another area that we're looking at and investing in, because in the airline, an average airliner has a utilization of 11 hours a day. And the average corporate jet or private aircraft, it's 1 hour a day. So there's a lot of utilization. So we have a whole lot of concrete, meaning the airports, and a whole lot of airplanes. Not as many pilots, but that's coming too, of how we're solving that problem. So we were looking at both the infrastructure. Their regulations actually do allow you to take off at those smaller airports. And so Ashish can explain how that fits with the 10-seater in particular.
Yeah, so as Bonnie said, there's actually a very, if you go up and look up the CIA handbook, you can actually, it'll tell you how many airports there are in every country. So if you drill down into that, about half the planet has the stock like in the US. The US is the deepest, 13,000. Just in the Bay Area, there are 20 airports. From here, there's 3 or 4 just within 5 or 10 minutes drive that you can get onto. And the same thing applies in every country in Latin America, North America, Europe, Russia, Nordics. So there is an existing stock, and I think that stock is enough to drive the first 5-10 years of this kind of a business. At the same time, I think what defines an airport is going to change, and it's going to be changed by our platforms, and it's also going to be changed by the urban VTOL vehicles. Our view is an airport should be no more than a small airstrip and a fence. Right? Forget, the baggage belts. The moment you add the additional detail, you're killing the speed on that trip, and also you're making it harder for people to build those airports because it's cost. Right? So, I think what defines an airport is going to shrink very dramatically over the next 10 years. But for the first 5 years, 10 years, I think there's an existing stock that's just waiting to be lit up. And some of these are growing grass, and some of these are being converted into developments. And in fact, there was a friend of mine who, is like Bonnie is a transport pilot, and he has to fly every so often. And he called me. He said this last weekend he flew from into this beautiful beautiful 6,000, 7,000 foot runway up in Bremerton near Seattle, and he's like, there's probably just 2 aircraft leaving there every day. And all we need, at least for our starter aircraft, is 2,500 feet. That's it. And the 50 seats, 3,500 feet for the first generation aircraft. Our successive generations will be even shorter runways and may one day become vertical takeoff. So.
And the commercial model, people wonder what about all the security and such at the various stages. So at 10 seats and less, it's just going to the local airport. It's a fence and a run. As you get 30 seats, there's a little bit more security and such. You get 100 seats, you need to go into that more congested space. But the serving of the smaller communities, so many communities have lost service because the cost of operating jet aircraft into these small airports just is not sustainable. Other questions?
So, first of all, congratulations on such a wonderful effort. A couple of things that came to mind regarding hurdles to cutting down on transportation time. Number one, has the technology been validated to perform comparable performance to existing aircrafts in terms of travel time? You know, are the engines going to be powerful enough? And the other that comes to mind is after 9/11, when aircrafts were used as weapons, is there any concern around security issues bogging down this check-in time and just the operational time for these type of aircrafts?
So you take the first one, I'll take the second.
Yeah. So I think this has been validated. We are looking at for the smaller aircraft between 60 and 80% lower direct operating costs than a comparable airliner. So by the 2030s, a conventional aircraft will not be able to fly against a hybrid, guaranteed. Right, and for that we thank the ground EV industry and what they're doing on the costs of batteries. In terms of the whole question around security, and that's why that's it's not in our control. But the bulk of the time, it's really the baggage handling is controllable, and that's one where you can go after very directly. All right, just by designing cabins so people carry baggage on like they would do if you board a bus. And if you push it out in today from a regulatory standpoint, as Bonnie said, you don't need TSA until you hit a certain size of aircraft. And there is a bunch of very interesting technologies around biometrics coming in that are promising much more streamlined security systems in the future. So we tend not to worry too much about it and just focus on the areas we can control, which is the aircraft needs to be able to land really close to communities, right? So you aren't driving to a big hub. And in that realm, actually speed in flight at cruise is often counterproductive over regional distances. A slower aircraft will actually get you to destinations faster. And then from a security standpoint, if you can replicate airline economics and smaller aircraft, boom, you're under the TSA radar right away. And, we don't want that to be baggage belts,
So I think this is where, if we always thought about what if and all the different regulations, innovation would never happen. But while we're empowering Ashish to work on how to transform the actual vehicle, we're also partnering with startups and looking at how do we speed the airport process. So at the moment, yes, his first aircraft will likely be in the smaller range where it'll take off from the airports that don't have those security, it's just the fence. But let's just say that by then, we do need to have security at those airports. We're partnering with startups that are helping through the biometrics process so it becomes very, very quick and easy. So the whole thing is about making seamless experience, thinking through all of the technologies that could make that happen. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. There's 2 right here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Karanveer Mondre from Bangalore, India. I run a life sciences consulting firm. I was just wondering, how do you as a venture capital fund look at technology obsolescence? Because you're looking very far into the future, and you already have the technology is already changing to drones, and Dubai is talking about having autonomous drones serving its industry. So I wonder whether in 20 years' time, 10 years' time, whether aircrafts will still be serving short-haul things, or whether they'll be probably replaced by single 4-seater, 8-seater drones, which will probably be autonomous?
You know, there is a parallel track that's out there, vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. That's the VTOL, and going through the air like a helicopter, if you will, as a drone. That likely could work. There's the question about airspace then becoming as congested as the roads. We'll see where that goes. But that type of vehicle going the distance, say 100 miles up to 1,000 miles, probably not as scalable once you move along. So that's where you need to move into more what we call the fixed wing, which is what Sunam is. So the target area and the focus is really that 100 miles to 1,000 miles. We'll see if the helicopter, vertical takeoff and landing, and drones, where that'll go, and we'll see where the pilot side is, where that will head as well. I think that the biggest issue will be the airspace, and you can't make the aircraft so tightly connected to each other as like on a traffic jam on a Highway 101. So I think that more restrictive might be on the vertical takeoff and landing aircraft might be restricted simply because there's just not enough room for all of them. So.
Yeah, and I think in a space of this kind, this is also partly the responsibility of an entrepreneur like myself, and we actually have very extensive models all the way out to 2030 of all the competing modes we see arriving, like autonomous cars, like urban VTOL vehicles. We watch every one of them. We modeled a lot of them, and because especially in the aviation industry, you're building a product that has to last 20 years. So you actually have to have a pretty good view of what that landscape is going to look like and how your product is going to be differentiated and is going to be current and is going to protect your own customers from obsolescence, right? And these are sort of things that both JetBlue Technology Ventures and Boeing sort of drill down into extensive detail in sort of when evaluating the investment.
Yeah. So I think we have time for one more question, and then I know that there's lunch out there, so but we'll stay here for a couple more minutes to answer other questions. So one more question, I think somebody right behind there had a question.
Can I?
Yeah.
Hi, Evgeny Borisov, Vimana, we autonomous aerial VTOL AAV producers. We just came back from Uber Elevate Summit, and this guys, they're sort of cool to have truly believers here.
Yep.
My question is quite simple because we developed like VTOL AAV, which actually operates within 900 miles range. So it's not that future. It's kind of present day. So do you think that that not a VTOL solution can of the nearest future can actually compete with VTOLs, in 2020, because like in 2020, I'm not repeating the previous thoughts, but in 2020 they already gonna the Uber is going to launch these commuting vehicles. Mm-hmm. So I'm just trying to understand, this solution, with your range, who you going to compete with in in 5 years when you get this technology running?
Yeah, I think this is similar to the prior question.
Yeah.
We've got models of these vertical takeoff aircraft, and we know how we are differentiated. Right? Yeah. So there is a very, very significant operating cost differential, right? So I think there will be some segments of the market. I mean, if you look at aviation today, you have a lot of a whole different varieties of vehicles serving different pools of demand, and they are tailored to those pools. And I think the future is going to be similar, where these boundaries lie will shift based on the change in propulsion. Mm-hmm. And we've got a very strong point of view around that, right? So.
And I think, and I'll wrap with this, is the way we look at it is there's a lot of new technologies out there that are happening. We believe that air transportation is absolutely going to be disrupted. Whether it's your business model of VTOL, whether it's the drones, whether it is the approach that Ashish is taking, I think it's very, very, very important for
so
all.
It's blue ocean,
It's blue ocean, right? It's blue ocean, and so we're very much. And I think that the companies that are putting their head in the sand saying it won't, or communities. I think that when you look at cars and you look at trains, you look at boats, there's all different types of ways to approach how you get from point A to point B, and we're out in the community looking at it. In this particular case, we're very, very passionate about what Ashish is coming, because we believe it's a niche that is not being served in some of the other startups. And kudos to you for what you're doing in the VTOL space. So VTOL is vertical takeoff and landing. There's so much interesting activity there. So with that, I think we're at the end. So thank you very much, and we'll stick around for additional questions. Thank you.